Allegedly, the last 2 points were agreed upon. Armenia agreed to the last 2 points of the peace agreement. How realistic is it that a peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia will be signed? And here, I wanted to ask you about Pashinyan. Explain this turnaround to me. Allegedly gave instructions and issued an order for all state structures of Armenia, turned around and started contacting Russia with Russian authorities, Russian officials, and state structures. Why? Because allegedly, the warming of agreements, the warming of relations between the USA and the Kremlin encourages Armenia to take steps towards Russia.
On Ukrainian channels and your channel as well. You remember, I also called Pashinyan's actions intriguing music, a political split between Russia and the West, and mentioned that it's quite likely that such political acrobatics, a political split, could lead to political trouble. In principle, we are observing this now. About Biden centricity of Armenian statehood throughout all the years of its independence, because Armenia have always been based for the United States of Armenia and in principle in Europe on this left liberal ideology. And therefore, in large part in France, they adhere to this ideology and they support the diaspora. They support precisely that political mop-on line in France. It's the same here in the United States of Armenia, because the majority of them live in California, where there are over 1 million of these ethnic Armenians. Well, in a few other states, there are about 20, 30, or 50,000 living, but mainly it's California. And all the leaders of the United States of Armenia who live there are from there, and some who later held key positions, well, such as Joe Biden himself, Antony Blinken, Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, Bob Menendez, who received 11 years in prison for corruption. So these were all leaders of the Armenian contest. And to this day, except for Menendez, who is in prison, they all continue to remain so. And I haven't mentioned many other names. They have always been in key positions. That's why the bet on the Democratic Party and chaos and the fiasco that the Democratic Party suffered after the November 5th elections, including Kamala Harris, who is also a native of California, and the entire Armenian diaspora, led by Kim Kardashian, invested hundreds of millions of dollars in her election campaign. And they also suffered this fiasco. So naturally, as you can understand, Donald Trump and his team are well aware of this. He talked about this during his first term in 2016 when he was campaigning in California, flying and traveling. He mentioned it there. I remember when in 2020, when already the Second Karabakh War began. Let me remind you that the Second Karabakh War started on September 27, 2020. And already 2 months later, there were the presidential elections in which Donald Trump lost to Biden, that is in 2 months. Therefore, at his campaign rallies and Armenian voters, but ethnic citizens of Armenia, they approached him and he openly told them, who do you always support? Joe Biden? Well, let him deal with your problem, your historical homeland. That's exactly what he said. That is, he distanced himself from this issue. He did not support Azerbaijan. But he did not get involved in these issues, as Joe Biden did, for example, just 2 months later when he came. For example, during Donald Trump's time, just so you know, the 907th Amendment of the US Congress, which was adopted in 1992 against Azerbaijan, labeled us as aggressors, yes, and supported the aggressor Armenia in this regard. And it always provided support, meaning the US Congress funded Armenia, Azerbaijan. It was prohibited to provide any support. Then when September 11, 2001 happened and so on, then Afghanistan and everything else, Azerbaijan was needed. Airfields, a transit point, logistics there, and they kept freezing this 907th Amendment all the time. All the presidents who later sat in the Oval Office froze it, including Donald Trump. As soon as Joe Biden came into office, he immediately reinstated it. And for all 4 years of his term, it was in effect against Azerbaijan, despite the fact that Azerbaijan seemed to be helping America. It wasn't Biden who was helping. Moreover, when these troops from Afghanistan The Kabul airport, just so you know, was guarded by the Azerbaijani Ministry of Defense Special Forces. At that time, Azerbaijan and Turkey. There was no one else there, no Americans, no one. Therefore, when Stoltenberg even expressed gratitude at the NATO session, he said that the only non-NATO country that provided immense support was Azerbaijan. And as soon as the Afghanistan issue was over, they reinstated the 907th Amendment. That is to say, when Azerbaijan was needed, it was acceptable, but now it's no longer needed. And now Armenocentrism is becoming the focal point. And off it went. An attempt to pass some paper through Congress, then an attempt through the UN Security Council, the European Parliament, all sorts of silly papers. They achieved nothing in these 4 years. During Joe Biden's term, Azerbaijan achieved everything. That is, if during Donald Trump's time, we regained 95% of Karabakh, there was a 5% piece left where the so-called Russian peacekeepers were. So over these 4 years, we closed that issue as well. Fully restored the sovereignty of territorial integrity. Moreover, we ensured that not a single ethnic Armenian remained there. They voluntarily left the territory in plain sight, in front of the whole world. That is, no ethnic cleansing occurred there, nothing. What do you think in a situation where the most pro-Armenian president was sitting in the White House of the United States, if they couldn't do anything against Azerbaijan, which was in command? On the ground and geography, you don't choose it. It can be an advantage or a disadvantage. That is, considering that we have Russia and Iran, this is a disadvantage for us in terms of geography. But considering that Armenia is in a deadlock today, that is, it has no access to the ocean, the sea, or anything, its only outlet to the world, the border, is through Iran. And Iran is considered an enemy of the civilized world. On one side, there's Turkey. On the other side, Azerbaijan. And on the third side, Georgia, which is a strategic partner of Turkey and Azerbaijan, among others. And what should Armenia do, which has neither gas nor oil nor access to anywhere, no logistics? They are at an impasse. Yes, the only thing they have are Russian military bases. And what next? So they had all this working until the Second Karabakh War. And after the Second Karabakh War, this is already completely opportunistic, changed. And in Moscow, the winds are blowing differently now, especially after the confrontation between Moscow and the West after 2008. August, with Georgia, after 2014, Crimea and Donbass, and after the last 3 years of Russian aggression against Ukraine, as you can see, the Iron Curtain is back, and the significance of the South Caucasus. The logistics, and it turns out the leader here is Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan's #1 strategic partner is Turkey, the second largest army in NATO. In this situation, Azerbaijan and Turkey have done everything to ensure that Russia does not interfere in this matter, as it did in the First Karabakh War during NATO under Yeltsin. And all this happened during Pashinyan's time. Initially, Pashinyan did not fully have this understanding, according to analysts. He was counting on Russia to intervene. When he saw that Russia did not intervene and that Russia is not thinking about the interests of Kazakhstan, Armenia, or anyone else, but only about Russia's interests, including Belarus and Ukraine. In this situation, as we are, it was advantageous for them not to intervene, which was demonstrated. And of course, Pashinyan immediately turned to the West. He turned to the West, the European Union, and ran to Washington. And what could they do? The only thing they could do was they made a public spectacle. But in reality, they achieved nothing. And it came November 5th. Biden suffered a fiasco. The entire Democratic Party and this ideology suffered a complete fiasco. Plus, the first blow was struck. The first blow delivered by Donald Trump and his team against USAID. USAID, and through mass media, I mean both Voice of Armenia and Radio Liberty, and all the others that were Armenia-centric. And the funding of all projects, non-governmental, supposedly humanitarian, these concerns, everything that was funded there in Armenia, everything went through this USAID, and this funding was completely halted. Pashinyan got on a plane, flew to Paris. When Donald Trump arrived there, he wanted to negotiate with him. Macron, who is his main ally in Europe, what could he do? He led him to Trump, who simply took a photo. But he also led the former president of Georgia. And what next? What can be done with this photo? Well, hang it in your bedroom, that's it. Tangible planes in reality? Does this work somehow? Not at all. He returns after that, when the inauguration had already taken place. Donald Trump came to the White House. He, naturally, through his diaspora, through all his lobbyists, hoped that he would meet with Donald. He arrived in the United States from Armenia. He was here for a long time, a whole week. He was waiting for an audience. Donald Trump did not receive him. Pence met with him at one of the meetings, a large meeting where a huge number of political leaders were invited. It was the same for Pashinyan. A similar protocol photograph was also taken there. With Pence, again, in this situation, Pence, as you understand, is not an independent political figure. He does everything that Donald Trump does. If it had been deemed necessary to receive the Prime Minister of Armenia, he would have been received at the White House, as in principle all democratic leaders have always done. This did not happen here. What does this indicate? It indicates that the times of the Democratic Party and its attitude towards Armenia, its significance for the political establishment here in the USA have passed. He understood this and is returning to Armenia. Upon returning to Armenia, naturally, he meets with his people, explains this situation. Surely in America, they explained a lot to him clearly. And suddenly it turns out that, and this happens just at the moment, when Witkov was already in Moscow, and Witkov's plane is flying to Baku. And Pashinyan comes out and says that the Armenian side and then the Azerbaijani side announced simultaneously that the last 2 points have been agreed upon, which had not been agreed upon for a long time. And suddenly he quickly agreed to this. The last 2 points, I will explain to you what these points are. That is the withdrawal of all legal claims from international judicial bodies and the withdrawal from the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. There are peacekeepers, the so-called EU mission observers who spend the whole day with binoculars spying on Azerbaijani territory. Azerbaijan clearly stated that this should not happen, so anywhere you want, but not on the border with Azerbaijan. Well, they didn't want to do this, but now they have agreed to it as well. But I want you to understand what these 17 points are. Because when this topic, the war ended in 2021, the president of Azerbaijan said, the war is over, we have won. Now Azerbaijan offers you 5 main principles. Let's build our peace agreement based on the 5 principles of our united organization. That is sovereignty, territorial integrity, unblocking all communications, restoration of diplomatic relations. These are the basic principles. To these 5, 17 more were added. This was the coordination, meaning these principles. For you to understand, the OSCE Minsk group for 26 years, Russia, France, and the USA were engaged in this coordination. For 26 years, they couldn't reach an agreement and a priori it was impossible, because Russia, France, and the United States had different interests. And we were like boys to them, to be beaten so that they could, so to speak, control the situation through a controlled conflict in this regard. And for better or worse, this suited everyone. These 3 countries were satisfied with it, including Armenia, because it occupied and was in charge there along with Russia. But Azerbaijan was the only one not satisfied with it. Well, the time came, and we changed all of that, this status quo. And now we are saying that the OSCE Minsk group should be dissolved, since it no longer exists, since the Karabakh issue is no longer there, the war is over. Why do we need the OSCE Minsk group? Let's, the 2 of us, Armenia and Azerbaijan, directly, without the OSCE Minsk group, without intermediaries. Let's resolve, so to speak, our relations. And these 5 principles have reached 17. And all those that were added there, just so you know, all the carrot and stick, that is peace through strength, as Donald Trump talks about. Azerbaijan. Previously, Donald Trump applied this peace through strength over Armenia. And all these 17 points, they were enforced through strength, because the Azerbaijani army is stationed at the border, the conditional border. We don't have a border, a conditional border, and we occupy all the key points on this border. And Armenia, seeing that the United States doesn't fit in, France doesn't fit in, Europe doesn't fit in, Russia doesn't fit in. Where should they go? Where should they run? And so they ran a week before the inauguration. Blinken and Ararat Mirzoyan signed the US-Armenia Strategic Partnership Agreement. I asked, where is this document? I called it toilet paper. Has anyone heard about this document today? No one has heard. Donald doesn't care about it because he nullified everything that Joe Biden did with Blinken and their administration, not only regarding Armenia, he nullified it all over the planet. He's starting from scratch with both domestic and foreign policy and economic relations with everyone in the world, including some Armenia, which he might not even find on the map. So as not to offend, maybe he won't find Azerbaijan or Georgia either in this regard. Yes, and he doesn't need to. He has a team for that. He has special representatives who are obliged to know this. And one of them, Steve Witkoff, who is a special representative for the Middle East, is his closest friend of 40 years. Donald Trump and Witkoff were in business together. One of his most trusted people, a billionaire, Tomo, flying on his own plane all over the planet. And so he arrived in Baku. Why did he come to Baku? Now I will decode it for you. I mentioned this recently. I can repeat it on your channel's broadcast. In my understanding, he came for the Nobel Peace Prize for Donald Trump. Because if Donald Trump is not in line for the Nobel Peace Prize on the Russian-Ukrainian front, as we see in the Middle East as well, it is not happening because they are shooting again there. Because the Middle Eastern conflict is very difficult to resolve. It hasn't been resolved for 70 years. The Russian-Ukrainian topic, again here, it's impossible to receive. Moreover, to whom will the world give the Nobel Peace Prize? Does that mean it should be given to Donald Trump, Zelensky, and Putin? Who would agree to that? No one would ever agree to that. So we understand this. But there is a ready conflict that has already been resolved. That is, the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan has ended. Sovereignty is territorially established, all within the framework of international law. As if Armenia also realized that there's a new sheriff in Washington. In Europe today, they are not concerned with Armenia at all. Russia today seems to be just as interested in ensuring that in Armenia, there were fewer representatives of the left liberal. And with Donald Trump, it seems they are starting to have some contacts. And if in this situation, Russia gets its piece of the pie in Armenia, why not? And Pashinyan, who made this somersault first towards the West 3 years ago, when after 4 years ago, when the Second Karabakh War happened. Today, as you can see, he is returning again. The return of the prodigal son, as they say. But I still don't know how much this will happen, how much it will be in the real plane, and what it will look like. But in any case, his political somersault, I understand. But if you ask me, this is the end of all this, and the peace treaty is about to be signed. I will tell you right away, no, Azerbaijan will not agree to sign a peace treaty. One can agree to sign these, how should I say, declarations, these 17 points, but this is not a final peace treaty. It is an agreement on the principles on which a final peace treaty can be built. Because the final peace treaty for the president of Azerbaijan. On that day, when it was announced and when Witkoff arrived in the evening, he publicly, just like that, the president of Azerbaijan never says anything. He appeared on the same day at an international forum. There was an international forum in Baku with the participation of $400 delegates from around the world. Former and current leaders, presidents, and prime ministers were there. He spoke there and openly said, the trust in Armenia, including the current leadership, is 0%. We do not trust them at all. If they agree to anything today, on any points, it is only under our pressure. Directly, the sword of Damocles is hanging over them. And they understand that today, no one in the world will support them, neither the West, nor Russia, nor Iran, among others. It is enough to look at the status quo that has developed today. Based on this, Azerbaijan insists that in addition to these 17 points, there are two main preconditions. They precede these 17 points, and Armenia has not fulfilled them to this day. The first and most crucial is the amendment of Armenia's constitution. The constitution of Armenia. 35 years ago, when Armenia gained its independence, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they had in the preamble, in the Declaration of Independence, it is written in black and white that Karabakh is an integral part of Armenia. That's all. This is exactly like, for example, how Russia today has included in its constitution these four regions, Crimea, and Donbass. This is all in their constitution. Ukraine or some Ukrainian president will go to sign some peace agreement with Russia today or in 10 years. I can never imagine that any Ukrainian president would agree to this. Similarly, Azerbaijan will never agree to this. We don't need a peace treaty with Pashinyan or some other Yan who will take his place. We need a treaty with the Armenian state, and a rock-solid treaty that will pass through international structures and the United Nations, among others. That is to say, change the constitution. By changing the constitution naturally, and the second point, this precondition, is the dissolution of the OC Minsk group, which still exists to this day. In order to dissolve it, Armenia, together with Azerbaijan, must jointly appeal to the OC. But they are not doing this either. This means they want to bide their time. Maybe tomorrow the geopolitical situation will somehow end to have some legal basis to nurture revanchist goals. some goals regarding Azerbaijan. That is, if they are weak today, then perhaps the situation will change and they will be able to continue claiming territory in Azerbaijan. That's why Azerbaijan is acting so firmly today. Just because you are loudly proclaiming that you are ready to sign today, it doesn't mean Azerbaijan will do it. And no matter who tries to pressure Azerbaijan, I repeat to you, for 4 years, Washington had the most pro-Armenian administration. It achieved nothing. If today a different administration comes, one that is not pro-Armenian, pragmatic, business-minded, who count money, they understand perfectly well that in the South Caucasus, the leader today is Azerbaijan. The entry is Azerbaijan, the exit is Georgia, that is through China to Europe. And where is Armenia on the map here? It's nowhere to be found. So, who will consider the interests of Armenia? Therefore, Azerbaijan tried, I think Whitaker came to Baku, it was explained to him clearly, and if Donald Trump wanted to win a Nobel Prize, please pressure many. In the United States, Armenia continues to pour fuel in the Armenian direction, pressure the Europeans, who also continues this matter, resolve the issues promptly, pressure Armenia in that regard, and then it won't need to be dragged out for 2 years. As Pashinyan said, in 2 years, they will change this constitution, and in 2 years, they are counting on some geopolitical situation to change. And why should we rush with this? And if Donald Trump wants to receive the Nobel Prize, well, then move in this direction and apply pressure. I think that's exactly why Witkov came regarding this topic. But, of course, there was the topic. Iran stood apart, and it is very important in this context to read the key analytical centers, including the Heritage Foundation, which is directly working with the Republican administration today, not to mention the media, which came out with such articles, and this was also in Israel, including in the Jerusalem Post, for example, which covered it in great detail. In the Knesset, in Israel, it was discussed, and representatives of Netanyahu's government also spoke on this topic about the need to create such a triangle, Azerbaijan, Israel, United States of Armenia, and to connect this triangle to the very Abrahamic agreement, which for Donald Trump is considered his main success in his previous term, and he wants to strengthen this direction. Do you see Armenia anywhere here? No. Therefore, this is also from this area. Because if we are talking about Abrahamic, I mean, Abraham is the forefather, so to speak, the great-great-grandfather of Judaism, Muslims, and Christianity, right? Therefore, the United States of Armenia is a Christian country. Israel is Judaism, and Azerbaijan is a Muslim country. And considering that Azerbaijan is part of the Commonwealth of Turkic states today, as you understand, the organization of Turkic states, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan are key countries. Do you think this generates interest in the United States and in the administration of Donald Trump? Moreover, this includes logistics, energy infrastructure, and everything else, definitely. Therefore, I think this topic was also a subject of discussion. And if we recall that before this, both the president of Azerbaijan and his close circle, members of his team, actively met with Netanyahu, the president of Israel, the foreign ministers, and the defense minister of Israel. In this matter, Turkey plays a very active role, and Azerbaijan is doing everything to improve relations between Turkey and Israel. That is, these are processes that today indicate that Azerbaijan is a key player both in the South Caucasus and in the Middle East, and all the goals and objectives that are needed will be important to the current administration of the United States of Armenia, both through the prism of Israel and through the prism of Iran. Azerbaijan holds an important place. I think this is exactly what I discussed. 7.5 hours in Baku with Special Representative Vudkov. And the political somersault, the split by Nikol Pashinyan, which cost him such a headache, definitely. He can continue moving in the same direction, or he will definitely need to make a stop somewhere. Otherwise, as the saying goes, he had one foot in the past and the other foot in the future. And between his legs was the harsh reality